to the St. George's podcast. I'm David, I'm the rector at St. George's.
And I'm Roxanne Brundle, and I'm the associate pastor.
And today we have the Revd Jessica Schaap with us, who is the Missioner for Christian Formation in the Diocese of New Westminster. And we're going to be talking all about Lent. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you and to be here.
Great to have you with us. For me, it feels like Lent comes around quicker every year. Maybe that's just because I'm getting older. But we've got a few things that we'd like to chat about. And just to kick off, what even is Lent for someone who doesn't know?
Yeah, so Lent is a season of preparation. It's the 40 days before Easter. So it's a time when we are preparing ourselves for that celebration. And the 40 days comes from the story of Jesus. When Jesus is in the wilderness, at the very beginning, just before he starts active ministry, he goes into the wilderness and he's there for 40 days where he is tested in various ways.
I'm just wondering, coming from a Catholic background as a kid and then being in the Protestant denomination, is Lent something that's practiced all over the world, all denominations?
It's definitely practiced all over the world, but I don't think it's practiced in the same way across all denominations. And I grew up in a church that never practiced Lent. So it's not across all denominations. It tends to be, like you said, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Anglican, Lutheran, some United churches, depending on their backgrounds and so on. Yeah, those are the main ones that observe it.
And why even bother with Lent? Like, what is the purpose of Lent?
Yeah, so the phrase I love to use for Lent is that it's the springtime for the soul. And the reason why we would want to do that is, like, if we were gardeners and our soul was soil, we would need to work it and to till it and to prepare it in order for there to be growth and new life and celebration. So that's one reason. And the other is so that we can get ready for a truly joyful celebration of Easter. Lent helps us to do that too. And I think that why we'd want to do Lent as well is that it can give us a new awareness of gracefulness. So sometimes we can find Lent hard and challenging, and it's demanding. But the point of it is actually to realize more of God's grace in our lives.
So for somebody who's done Lent lots of times before, I've given up all sorts of things in the past, sometimes quite successfully, other times I've spectacularly failed. The year I tried to give up caffeine for Lent, I had such a headache by 9 o'clock on the first day that I went and drank a very large pint of Coke to try and get some caffeine and sort out my headache, and it didn't work. So I gave that up. So, I mean, how do we, I gave up giving up caffeine. How do we find ways to choose what's appropriate for us to give up? And is, I guess, another question I'll say for a minute that, do we even need to give something up? But let's assume we do. How do we decide?
Sure. That's such a good question. And I think about it every year too. I think one way is to give yourself time to decide so that you can kind of discern what would be something that's life-giving, something that seems to be relevant. So one of the things I look for is there anything repeating for me in the weeks before Lent? Is there anything coming up? Is there something in the world that's happening? Like, a lot of people are looking to creation care or anti-racism, and they want to engage in some way with what's going on in the world. So looking for those patterns, or maybe you're realizing, gosh, I'm pretty attached to my smartphone, and I'm doom scrolling at night before I go to sleep, and it's not working for me in my life anymore. Maybe those little hints are the things we can look to choose about giving up. I hear you about the caffeine one. I tried it too, and I miserably failed. And I needed to have my coffee in the morning. One of the things I like in the Eastern Orthodox Church is they're very pastoral when it comes to fasting, and it's really customized to the individual. And if you've picked a certain form of fasting that's sort of becoming harmful, they're going to tell you not to do it and to find something else that works. So I think it's discernment. And it certainly doesn't have to be just caffeine or chocolate. There might be some other things you're attached to that you would actually find more life in giving up.
I think over the years when I've thought of Lent, it's sometimes been about doing something more than giving something up. It's about committing to doing something that I normally wouldn't find time for. So I guess I'm giving up time for something positive.
Yeah, and the traditional practices of Lent are fasting, but the other two are prayer and almsgiving, which I think we can translate as serving or giving in some way. So that's like an adding on, I think, and also spending more time in spiritual practices. So prayer can take a huge range of forms. And those are all traditional practices as well, alongside some kind of fast. So yeah, I think a lot of people take on, and it could even be learning something new. Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I've always noticed about Lent is that it kind of captures the imagination of those who might be outside the church. And so even though it's very much a Christian act, I'll hear people who wouldn't even talk about Jesus or church or God, or they wouldn't pray, but knowingly. But yet somehow when Lent comes along, there can be a conversation in the workplace, around the water cooler or wherever, what are you giving up for Lent? And I wonder, have you seen that at all? And maybe is it something to do with this popularity that there is of late of kind of trying things for 30 days? A lot of videos on YouTube, I did this for 30 days and I walked 10,000 steps for 30 days and it changed my life kind of videos. And so I just wonder what the, how Lent might be a way for people to connect with church, even if they're not with a church now.
Yeah, I've found that it has been a great conversation, and people have a lot of curiosity about Lent because they're really curious. Well, what are you going to do, and why are you doing it? And I think you're right. There's currents in popular culture around kind of taking off a manageable project like that, 30 or 40 days. I also think there's a huge current of self-development and self-growth that's throughout our culture, that people want to, be getting better in some way. So Lent might look like a program that would help with that, or that makes sense to them. I think those things are all good entryways. And I also think even talking about our failures at Lent are good entryways too, because we're not just about self-development. We're about relationship with God, who is kind of the ultimate source of our identity and growth. So I think we can go and be in alignment with a lot of popular culture, and that can be really encouraging. And we can offer a nice alternative way of looking at it too, that I think is really grace-filled.
And I kind of think of myself as a kid when I didn't really know anything about Lent, and all I did was I just gave up candy because it was just the thing you did as a kid. What else could you give up? And I remember my aunt at the time saying, well, it's not just giving up candy, but it's remembering as you're giving it up why you're doing it. And I kind of think that it's not just about self-improvement, although that's great, but it's just a reminder of Jesus. And sometimes it's when you give up things that you really, really love, you have a lot more reminders of Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have reminders of people who go without these things a lot. So I think when we fast from anything, it puts us in a solidarity with other people who are going without, whether by choice or not. And I think that can open us up to compassion for our neighbors and for folks in other places in the world and in other lives and cultures. So I think I find that a helpful reminder if I'm fasting from something, is that, oh, I'm in the same boat now a little bit with someone else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think the COVID pandemic has really opened our eyes to
Yes.
different ways we can be in solidarity with each other. Everyone has suffered loss
Mm-hmm.
in some way.
Well, and even wearing a mask, at the beginning, when it wasn't the thing everyone had to do, I was just thinking, oh, wow, doctors wearing this like 8 to 10 hours a day and having to be in stressful, hard situations. And I'm just having to put it on for 15 minutes and having trouble. I mean, it just really give your head a shake and you go, come on.
It's such a great example. Or retail workers, right?
Yeah.
Having to wear it all day. Exactly. It's such a good example. We get a bit more insight.
Mm-hmm. So how do you decide? How do you decide what to do? How do you decide personally what you're doing this year for Lent?
Well, I often have a conversation with my family members because we have, I think, our best Lents have when we've kind of helped each other through it, and even committed maybe to the same practices together. So we'll talk a few weeks before and say, so what do you think? What should we give up? Or what do we want to add on this year? Or do we want to try a new kind of prayer together? And do we want to do it every day? Or do we want to do something once a week? So we have all those conversations a couple of weeks before. I read on the internet what people are doing. So there's a couple of resources that I have found, and I have found them to be inspiring, and then I think about them. And I spend some time in quiet listening to God. And I don't know what's going to happen in those periods, but I really just sit and try and listen in silence and see what comes up. Maybe it's an image. Maybe it's a theme, or it's a little hard to describe, but it happens when I take the time to listen. Something will come up, and that's often will be the kind of the clincher for deciding. Yeah, they call it testing the spirit sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. So suppose somebody's decided to give something up for Lent, and they're partway through, and then they find they fail. Probably not my example of coffee giving up Lent on the first day, but suppose 2 weeks into Lent you've given up chocolate, and then somebody's been to the Purdy's store and brings in into the family home or into the office a massive tray of Purdy's, and you give in and you have some. What do you do then?
Well, I think the thing to do is just be like, well, I did it. I can just turn back and go back to my practice. So that's kind of the fundamental move. We hear the word repentance a lot in Lent, and we'll hear it, and that can sound really negative, but it translates fundamentally as turning back to God. So that's all I think that needs to happen. Don't need to go down a shame spiral. Just make that turn back to that practice that you want to commit to. Is the simplest thing. Now, if it's become harmful, then maybe you discern a new practice halfway through.
Yeah, I think that's great suggestion, because I know for me, I've found in the past if I've failed at Lent somehow, or I felt I failed at Lent somehow partway through, and then I think, well, I'm not going to bother anymore because I didn't manage to do it. I almost liken it to trying to learn a piece of music or a song, only learning the beginning bit, because every time you get to a point where you get stuck and then have to go back to the beginning again, and then rather than carrying on all the way through to the end, to kind of then practice the whole thing. And so I think that's a great suggestion. Just tomorrow's another day, and get up and have another go.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of technical questions, which some people might be wondering. So one of those is around, we use the color purple in Lent. And in my, if you're watching this visually, you can see that I've got a virtual background. That's because the room I'm in has got mess behind me. So I've got a virtual background there. And the virtual background I have is the chapel at St. George's photo that was taken probably a year ago when it was Lent. And truthfully, the colors haven't changed in the chapel because of COVID, we've not been in there. So that's my little purple story behind me. But yeah, what is the significance of the color purple?
Purple is the traditional color in Lent. And one of the reasons is because purple was traditionally considered a penitential color. So I mentioned about the theme of repentance, and purple has been associated with that. But I think more importantly, purple has been associated with royalty. And that the color purple then means, well, what's the royalty associated? And it's the king that we're waiting for. And that king is Jesus, to be revealed as the raised Son of God. So that's the deep meaning of purple over the centuries, is that it carries both this penitential aspect and also the royal aspect for the one whom we claim as our Lord.
Awesome. That's a great great way of thinking of it. And my other technical question is around, I remember many years ago when I'd faithfully observed Lent from Ash Wednesday to Easter Sunday. And I remember my world being shook when I think a priest told me that actually I didn't have to observe Lent on a Sunday. And I quote, that it's a greater sin to fast on a feast day than feast on a fast day. And the second part of that was then a confusion of, well, does Lent end on Palm Sunday or on Maundy Thursday? So I'm sure this is subjective and it's about what's helpful to people. But I mean, what do you think? When does Lent start? When does it finish? And what do we do about Sundays and feast days?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I had to look it up too, because the church has not had a consistent practice over the centuries on this. So don't worry about it. Mostly these days, it's the 40 days from Ash Wednesday to the Easter Vigil, not including Sunday. That's so amazing. Yes, that tongue twister you had was kind of right on. We drop the Lenten disciplines and we celebrate on Sundays. So they remain the feast days and celebrations of the resurrection.
And you know what? I think that's actually probably helpful for some people who, you know, I know people that do healthy eating plans and they have a cheat day. There's something about knowing that there's 6 days to do the plan and then a day to kind of have off, that can be helpful. And yeah, I know there have been confusions in the past sometimes around when a saint's day has been moved, and it happens a lot. There's a lot of popular celebration of especially St. Patrick, but also some of the other saints that typically have their feast days in Lent, and that's sometimes confusing because then the church is saying, no, you can't celebrate the feast day on the Wednesday. It's actually been translated. So does that typically happen in Lent, that they would move a saint's day to a Sunday?
It can happen, and I'm seeing quite a variety of practice when it comes to saints' days. I think the Roman Catholic Church has moved more towards privileging Lent observance over a saint's day, and so they would be either transferred to a later date, or they would just be kind of submerged if they happen to fall in that time. And then I see, transferring to Sunday. So we often have the Annunciation happen in Lent, which is a big feast because it's the news of the angel to Mary that she's going to give birth. to Jesus. That one is often maintained that I can see, and sometimes it's moved. Yeah, it's a variety of things. It can be a little bit like being in the thicket, trying to figure out what's the practice. And I think it's because it's different bodies are making different decisions.
Yeah, that's probably just a really technical rabbit hole I've taken everyone in. So apologies if no one else is interested in that. But I just, while we have you, I just thought I'm going to ask those things and see what you think. Roxanne, bring us back to earth.
Well, I was just thinking it's always important for everybody to remember that the whole purpose of it is to connect with God better and to understand and to celebrate what's coming. And so all these things are helpful things, but it kind of reminded me of Jesus talking about the Sabbath and what the Sabbath was for. And the Sabbath was, was something where we were supposed to connect with God, and all these rules and practices that were happening at his time took us away. So I think that it's as long as whatever we do for Lent, we are reminded of why we're even doing it, that it doesn't become something that, like you said, we get bogged down. Because I can see Satan using it, like to be able to go, see, you couldn't do that. You couldn't even do it for 2 days. And it was so good, Jessica, for you to say it's kind of our practice where we can say, no, I couldn't do it, but I'm sorry, and I'm going to try again. And that's kind of our life. That's really our life. That's what we're all about as Christians.
Yeah, I think the hope is during Lent is that we find we can lean more on God, and that we need to. We can feel like we are very disciplined or have lots of willpower or are strong, kind of confident, autonomous people, but Lent can bring us a kind of joyful realization that we're not. And we can lean in support with one another, our neighbors, and on God, and through our dependence on creation and all sorts of things, we can have new recognition of, even and in and with our weakness and failures.
Jessica, as you think over the years, what were some of the most meaningful practices or routines that you began in Lent?
Yeah, the one that first comes to mind, I think, is when I really slowly read through the Gospel of John.
Yes.
And I just took a tiny little passage each day for the season. And that, yeah, I mean, I think that was life-changing to do that. I had never read a book from the Bible so slowly. I had never heard of that, of just taking a few verses at a time. That was quite a while ago, but I remember that. I think I often find daily reading. It's a pretty simple practice, but I find that that's really helped me. And that can be books other than books from the Bible as well, but that are meditative and devotional in some way. I do think some of the fasts that I've taken, especially from my smartphone, we've done that as a family, and having evenings together where nobody's on a device has been really rich and peaceful for us. So that's been good. I have not had as much luck with other kinds of fasts. I think I mentioned the caffeine one too. I didn't go so well, but I learned something from it. So there's always that. I think there's always learning, no matter what practice we choose, and that's a really great thing. Yeah.
How old are when you say that your family, are we talking young kids? Are we talking young adults? Like,
I have a 10-year-old daughter.
Oh, okay. So that's great to know, because sometimes the question is, how do we get our kids involved with Lent? And just to be having that discussion is I thought that's really a rich discussion to even have. Why bother? What are we doing? Let's do it together. Let's work together. It's kind of that community even feel that we are stronger together as Christians, as followers of Christ, if we're helping each other to keep on the road. I like that.
Yeah, one of the really simple things we do is we put in the middle of our eating table, it's like a vase or a bowl, and it has sand in it. And we put candles in it, and the sand kind of represents the desert or the wilderness that Jesus was in. And then we light candles, and then we sing a simple chant together.
Wow.
From Teze, Jesus, remember me when you enter your kingdom, when you come into your kingdom. This year we might do a different chant, and that becomes our dinner time or mealtime ritual opening for Lent, kind of sets it aside. And it's super simple, but we love it. And my 10-year-old now is like, now is the time for this, Mom. Yeah. So let's do it.
I love that, because we, you know, when you're raising a family, it's so hard to think of practical, simple ways to bring some of these practices into the home.
Yeah, it can take some time in a way to get simple. But that seems to be what works for us. This year, I think we're actually going to try and collect our regular change and money in a real old-fashioned practice to collect money for a cause that we want to support.
So what other ways are there of getting kids involved in Lent? Any good ideas there?
I think if you wanted to introduce a different kind of prayer, and that can be depending on age, but you could even use like the hand or finger prayer and learn like how to do Thanksgiving, how to do praise, how to pray for others, you know, how to pray for our leaders, and how to pray for ourselves. And, you know, you can do simple things like that you haven't tried before, that can be really kid friendly. I do think singing is a good one. Simple songs or maybe action songs can be really good. Depends on the kid, but there can be crafts and activities. I mean, there's just so much that you can do. We did a cross painting activity last year. The other thing that we've done that we really enjoyed, this is more towards Holy Week, but is to create a little Holy Week garden. So Holy Week is the week before Easter, and you put some dirt and some oat grass seeds, which sprout really quickly. And you put that and you create like a little tomb shape. You can do that with Play-Doh. You can do that with a covered bowl or a bottle. Put it with soil, put the oat grass seeds, and you watch the grass grow that week. And as a real symbol of the resurrection that has a huge impact on kids and adults, that's been really powerful to watch, literally watch new life come up while you are taking these steps into Jesus' story of his death and resurrection.
Awesome. Well, I know you've got a lot of resources. You've put together some information for the diocesan website, and we'll link to those in the show notes. Any 2 or 3 particular things you'd like to highlight with folks listening now?
Yeah, what comes to mind? There's this company's put out a great little booklet called Lenten Micro Practices. And that gives 40 different ideas for little spiritual practices to try based on the traditional practices. So what can you detach from or fast from? How can you pray? And how can you give or serve? And they're just little ways that you can incorporate into daily life. And they kind of have households in mind. So something could appeal to someone and maybe not to another, but there's opportunity for everyone to try something. I think that's a great entry into Lent and the different things. Another fun one is Lent Madness, which is something I've done for a few years, which it's kind of funny and it's more lighthearted, which we could do with, I think, in this time. And that is, you actually get a competition, as it were, between saints. And every day you sign up for the email and you get to hear 2 stories of holy men and women from the past and what they've done. And then they are voted on who do you want to see win for the day? And they're put into kind of like one of those sports tournaments.
I love it.
It's really fun, and it's very moving and inspiring to see how many different ways there is to live for God, and just some really inspiring people that I had never heard of, because they're going out and trying to find some of the unusual stories, and more contemporary stories as well, and international. So that one's fun. I like that one. Yeah. PWRDF, which is our Relief and Development Organization, is putting together a daily email of creation care stories and prayers. That's been a really recurring theme for the last few Lent is creation care practices and calendars and so on. Yeah, that's what comes to mind now. The Anglican diocesan website has a list. I also keep Pinterest boards, and I have quite a few extra things for Lent and Holy Week on there too. So if you're into Pinterest, check that out.
That's amazing. Thank you. Well, we'll make sure that all the information we can is linked in the show notes for this podcast. Just as we come to a close, Roxanne, any closing thoughts?
Well, Jessica, every guest that comes in this last year, we've asked a couple of questions based on the whole COVID restrictions. We are interested in what's the one thing that you have really been missing? Maybe what's the one thing you've really learned? And what are you looking most forward to when and if restrictions are lifted?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I keep coming back to is dinner parties. I just so miss hosting and going to friends and family's houses for dinner, for sharing a meal together in a big group. Yeah, I just can't wait for that. The other question was, what have I learned?
Yes. I
have found this past year to know and sense God's presence in a way, and in such a steady, faithful, enlightening way. I don't think I've ever known it so consistently as I have this year. And that's with all the emotional roller coaster. There's almost an accompaniment with that roller coaster, like, yeah, you're human. This is hard. And yet the grace and love, and I think just revelation of God everywhere has been really highlight for me. Yeah. And I hear it from others too. So I take great solace in that.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Jessica, for joining us. It's been great to hear from you and hear about Lent. As this podcast comes out at the start of February, and that means I think now Lent starts on Wednesday, the 17th of February, I believe. Did I get that right? Yes. Good.
Yes.
Okay, so if you're hearing this at the start of February, you've got a couple of weeks to decide what to give up or what to take on or what practice to adopt. But even if you're hearing this after Lent has started, it's never too late. So if you're hearing this in the beginning of March and you missed it, then great, glad you're here, and start today. So we hope that if you're listening, you have found some ideas, some inspiration, and thank you for joining us on the St. George's podcast. We are back on the first Wednesday of every month with a new podcast. You can see them on our YouTube channel if we put the video there, but the best place to find podcasts is on whatever your favorite podcast app is. So wherever you're listening to this now, you'll find all the podcasts. You can like and subscribe, and share it with a friend if you know someone who might find it interesting. And if you've missed some of the previous podcasts we've done, we've had a few guests on, and then other ones where Roxanne and I are chatting. So do go back and have a listen to some of those podcasts. But in the meantime, thank you again for joining us, and stay safe.